Hey there, it's Zeb. In another video, I talked about changes in demand in the supply and demand model and what that looked like graphically and the factors that would cause it and how it happens, how those changes manifest themselves in a market. And so in this video, I want to do the same thing, but with supply. So we will start with a supply and demand graph. We've got quantity on the horizontal, price on the vertical. Here's our supply curve. It's upward sloping to the right, and the demand curve slopes downward and to the right. The intersection is going to be the equilibrium. So here we have the equilibrium quantity. That's the number of units we believe will be bought and sold in the market. And then we've got the equilibrium price, P star. This is the price that we think the market will clear at. So this is our equilibrium. Now, an increase in supply means that at every possible price, sellers are wishing to sell at least as much and probably more than what they did before. So they're selling more units than they did before at various prices. So we would expect to see then an increase in supply to be a rightward shift of the supply curve. And this sometimes confuses students because they think that looking at that curve looks lower than the other one, but understand we are talking about quantities here. And so an increase in supply means more quantity, which means we shift to the right. So we're going to move from this equilibrium down to this equilibrium. At this new equilibrium, we get a higher quantity, that is, more is bought and sold, and the price in the market has fallen to P prime. So an increase in supply causes price to fall and quantity to rise. Now, a decrease in supply is the opposite. It means that at various prices, sellers now want to sell less than before for whatever reason. It could be a variety of reasons, and we'll talk about what some of those reasons are. But for whatever reason, they want to sell less than they did before. So a lower quantity, which means we're going to shift the supply curve to the left. So a leftward shift to the supply curve is going to move the equilibrium from the original equilibrium up to this new equilibrium, where we get a lower equilibrium quantity, Q double prime, and a higher equilibrium price, P double prime. So this is what changes in supply look like in a particular market. Now let's talk about the factors that actually would cause this to happen. So the factors that cause changes in the supply curve we call the determinants of supply. And the reason why they're called determinants is because they determine geometrically where the supply curve sits on this supply and demand graph in this price quantity space. So the determinants of supply, let's just talk about some of them. So one is going to be cost of production. So cost of production. For a given selling price, if the cost of production rises, then that means I'm making less profit per unit. And if I make less profit, I'm going to be less inclined to want to do that thing. So an increase in the cost of production generally means that sellers are willing to sell less at every possible price. And a decrease in the cost of production for a given selling price means that my profit's going up per unit, and I'm happy to sell more because I'm rewarded more for doing so. So that generally means I'm willing to sell more at every possible price, and so we get an increase in supply if cost of production go down. So a related idea, but one that books almost always talk about, is technology. And not just any technology, but the technology that gets used in the production of this good or service. Now, technology is related to cost of production, and the reason why firms generally employ technology is to lower their costs of production. But if we have more technology available, workers are generally just going to be more productive. And so for a given amount of effort, the output is generally a greater output. And so as a result, you expect to see a larger supply of goods and services, the more technology that you use in the production. If you have less technology, if something happens, a natural disaster destroys some kind of manufacturing plant or equipment that's used, or maybe a war destroys this, then you would expect to see a reduced supply. Another determinant of supply is just going to be the number of sellers in the market. If there are more sellers in a market, other things being equal, there's going to be a greater supply. And if there are fewer sellers in a market, other things being equal, the supply is going to go down, or it's going to shift the supply curve to the left. Another determinant of supply is the expectations that sellers have about the future prices. So we'll say expectations of sellers with respect to future prices. So sellers' expectations about future prices are going to affect how much they want to sell today. If I'm producing a product or service that has a relatively long shelf life, I'm not only going to care about what I can get for it now, but what I can get for it in the future. And if I think I might be able to get more for it in the future, I'm going to want to sell less today and hold on to it and sell more in the future. So as a result, the supply today falls, which would cause prices to actually start to rise. If, on the other hand, I expect the opposite, I think that the price is going to go down in the future and I'm selling, then I may want to sell as much as I can today before the price starts to fall. So this is going to mean that the supply increases, causing prices to actually start to fall down. So expectations of sellers with respect to future prices. And another is going to be the price of related goods and services. So essentially this, in the case of supply, it's analogous to one in the case of demand. But one way of thinking about this is that sellers are mindful not only of the value of the thing that they are currently doing, but of their other options and other things that they could be doing. So if you have a firm that produces two products and they can produce either one, and one of those products becomes a better value for them to produce, the price goes up, then they're going to be less inclined to want to supply the other one. All right. So that's something to keep in mind. Essentially, you can think of this simply as firms care about opportunity costs. And if the opportunity costs of their actions change, then they may change how much of that thing they want to do. If the opportunity cost goes up, then you're going to want to do less of that thing. If the opportunity costs of doing something go down, you're likely to do more of it. So that's something to keep in mind. Now notice what is absent from this list of determinants of supply. That is, what does not cause a shift in the supply curve. Well, that would be the price of the good itself. The price of the good itself does not cause a shift of the supply curve, but rather it causes movement along an existing supply curve. So rather than that being a determinant of supply, we call that a determinant of quantity supplied. So let's think about what this looks like on a supply and demand graph. Okay, so there's quantity, there's price, here's my supply curve. Suppose that this price, there we go. At this price P1, sellers want to sell this quantity Q1. But if the price goes up, say to P2, we see now, because sellers can earn more money for every unit that they sell, they want to sell more units. So we're moving from one point on the supply curve to another point as price changes. So a change in the price of the good itself is only going to be a determinant of quantity supplied, that is, position on an existing supply curve, and it's not going to cause the entire curve to shift. So we've talked about changes in supply, we've talked about the factors that cause that, we've talked about changes in quantity supplied. Now let's think about how these changes in supply actually bring about different equilibrium outcomes. So let's go back to this top graph, and we started initially with this equilibrium at P star Q star. And we said that if we had an increase in supply, this would cause price to go down and quantity that gets traded, the equilibrium quantity, to go up. Now let's think about why that happens. So imagine that supply goes up. Well, initially the price is not going to change. The price just is what it is, and all of a sudden the supply goes up. So let's call this point A, and we know we're going to wind up at point B. But initially, when supply goes up, sellers want to now sell more, but buyers are still wanting to buy Q star. Sellers now are at this point, and they want to sell, we'll call this point B prime, so we're at point B prime. Sellers want to sell Q prime S, right? This is how much sellers want to sell. So buyers want to buy Q star, sellers want to sell Q prime S. We see that we have a surplus. When we have a surplus, firms start competing against each other to try to sell their product to the relatively limited number of buyers that are available. So they start undercutting. They start trying to outbid each other to lower prices. So as firms start to lower their price, sellers are less willing to want to sell, and so they start selling less and less and less quantity, moving along that supply curve. But at the same time that that's happening, as the price is falling, buyers want to buy more. So they're buying more, moving along their demand curve. So as the price falls, buyers buy more, sellers sell less, and it eliminates this surplus that happened. So initially, an increase in supply causes a surplus. Then market forces start to happen, and this causes prices to fall and the surplus to be eliminated. On the other hand, if we have a decrease in supply, we know that we're going to move, if we're starting out at point A, we're going to wind up at point C. But let's think about how we get there. Well, initially the supply falls, and buyers still want to buy Q star at this price P star. But now that supply has gone down, sellers don't want to sell that much. At P star, they want to sell they want to sell whatever quantity is at point C prime. So we will call this Q double prime S. So that's the quantity that they want to sell, but buyers want to buy Q star. That's clearly more. So buyers want to buy more than sellers want to sell. So we have a shortage. And when you have shortages, buyers start competing strongly against each other to get the relatively limited amount of goods and services that are available. So this causes prices to rise. And as the price rises, sellers decide, hey, this is worth selling. And so they want to sell more, and more as that price rises. But as the price rises, it sends the incentive and sends the signal to the buyer, hey, maybe you need to think about cutting back on this. It's costing more than it used to. Do you really need that? And so as the price rises, buyers buy less as that price rises until they get to point C at this price P double prime. And at P double prime, buyers want to buy exactly what sellers want to sell, and we're in a new equilibrium. So just to recap, increases in supply cause temporary surpluses, and the market eliminates them as prices fall. Decreases in supply cause temporary shortages, and as prices rise, buyers buy less and sellers sell more until the market has eliminated that too. So I hope this video is instructive. Thank you for watching.